Hey, I'm Tom Mason, and today I'm going to show you the first part of how to sculpt the Goblin Baddie. The Goblin Baddie is a figure that I've wanted to sculpt for at least a year now, and with me coming back to YouTube, I thought this was the perfect time to do a full series of sculpting a miniature start to finish. So I'm really excited to show you the first part of this video where I show you how to sculpt the armature, and I hope you'll stick around and continue watching the whole series from start to finish.
Before I get into all the steps that I took to sculpt this miniature, I wanted to take a brief moment to show the concept art and just say that it can be so helpful, especially for me, to have a guide, visual, whether it's looking at reference or ideally what I found in more recent years, to have my own concept drawing. It just really gives me the chance to work out all the details and get really excited about the look and feel of the figure before I even start making the armature. So if you've never tried that, maybe give it a go. I have my concept, I know what I'm sculpting, so now we get to start making the armature. However, before we do that, let's take a second to go over the tools I'm using to make this armature. First, I'm using 24 gauge steel wire. That's my armature wire of choice, but you can use pretty much anything as long as it's sturdy and stable enough. You need at least one pair of pliers, although I do recommend two because there are times where you'll want to twist two wires together, and it's just way easier with two pairs. I usually have one that's got a broader head just for more general purpose use, and another that's very fine needle nose pliers, which you'll see me using mostly throughout this video. You also need a pair of wire cutters or snips to trim the wire down to size. And lastly, you need a ruler, good millimeter ruler. I really like this metal one, but another great one you can use is a clear ruler, because it lets you, place the miniature in front or behind, and you can very clearly see all the parts. Now, this is obviously not a human-sized miniature. This is a Goblin Baddie that I'm sculpting for my upcoming Kickstarter, and he's only going to be about 20 millimeters tall. He's going to be a little chunky, but he's not very tall. Therefore, the measurements are going to be a little different than you would see in a normal human. But the good rule of thumb is you want to have enough wire when you're making this main section of the armature so that you have a good amount of wire sticking out below the feet. That way it's got plenty of material to stick into your cork or your base to hold the miniature, and if you end up doing something more dynamic like raising a leg up off the ground, you have enough wire there to still be captured in the base. With any humanoid armature, you're going to need two wires. The first wire is going to make up the head, spine, hips, and legs. The second wire will end up getting twisted around this first wire, and that's going to make up the arms. The first wire is going to be much larger than the second wire because it's got to make up so much more of the armature. A good rule of thumb is to figure out the standing height, if your figure was just standing up straight, unposed, of your miniature, double that, and then add 20, if not maybe even 30 more millimeters to the wire. This wire needs to be folded in half to create both the legs and to give a little more support into the spine. And so when you do this, you'll have plenty of extra material sticking out the bottom of your miniature. And if you have too much, you can just trim it off. The wire used for the arms can be much shorter. So in the case of this miniature, I did about 70 millimeters for the first main wire, and only about half that, 35, for the arms. Now, that's not always a general rule for the arms. You really need to kind of figure out the overall length you're going to need. You need to include the length of the shoulders and then the arm going down. And just like with that first main wire where you need extra sticking out for the feet, it's always a good idea to have some extra wire sticking out from the hands in case you need to do something more intricate with that armature piece. Some of you who have watched my other videos might notice that I didn't add the extra little twist in the spine like I normally do. To be honest, I just completely forgot because it's been a long time since I've built an armature. But as you can see, you don't have to do that. You just have to be a little more careful once we get to the step of securing the arms to the spine, just to make sure everything stays together nicely. Because this goblin's proportions are so different than normal humans, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the actual exact sizes and things like that. I'll just say it's very important to have some sort of reference in order to measure off of to get the size of your armature, whether that's another figure you're using or the armature reference cards that I have available when you sign up to my mailing list. Once you've bent the first armature wire into position to create the spine, hips, and legs, and you've secured the armature wire used for the arms, before you do any posing on the arms, it's a good idea to secure it with a bit of putty. You can use straight green stuff for this, or in the cases you'll see here, I'm using a mix of green stuff and Aves Epoxy Sculpt. The reason I do that is the Aves help for two reasons, really. The Aves sets up a little faster when it's mixed in with the green stuff, and it's much harder, so it tends to not want to wiggle out of place very well. So just mix up your putty and stick it on there and let it cure. I went ahead and put my armature in a putty oven so that it would set up a lot faster, but otherwise you can just leave it to sit overnight, and it should be more than enough cured to allow you to start bending the arms into position. Just like with the other parts of the body, this is going to vary depending on the kind of size and proportion of your character. This guy's got pretty long arms in comparison to his body, so he ended up having arms very close to what I would do for a normal human. Just remember to keep checking your reference and bend them into shape, and make sure you leave a little extra towards the end to create a hand if you need to do that. And with that, you've finished making your armature. Now it's time to pose. Posing in armature is all about making fine, small little adjustments until you get the structure, to be where it needs to be. So I use my fine pair of needle nose pliers for this. It just gives me a lot more control. And you just want to make small little movements. I usually start with the legs, and this wire is very versatile. You can bend it quite a bit before it snaps, but you still don't want to overbend it. So it's a good idea to really take stock of your pose from your reference if you have it, or just really think about maybe pose in real life to get a feel or a sense of what you want it to be. And that way you can start to make the movements in the right direction and not keep having to go back and forth and stress that wire out. I do most of my initial posing when the armature is free from the sculpting block, but once I get the legs into rough position, especially just how far they're spaced, even more so than how they're actually bent, I go ahead and place the figure in the sculpting block. That just gives me a stability and a better reference of where the ground is for the figure, which will allow me to have a better sense of the actual weight and how the body really needs to shift. I really like these sculpting blocks. You can secure the armature to it, but if you need to take it out, you can just pop it right out. When you're ready to get it back on the block, you can secure it just as tight as when you first started sticking putty to it. Now the figure's grounded in the sculpting block, just continue posing until you make it match what you want the pose to look like, or the reference if you have that. Just keep playing with it a little bit here and there, as you'll see I'm doing, and you'll get there before you know it. One last thing I wanted to mention about the armature was you might notice that I added a little hook at the top of the head. So when you're making your armature, it's always good to make the spine from your hips to the top of the head a little longer than you probably have to make it. And the reason for that is I like to twist a little hook there. It makes there be a slightly larger area for your putty and material to grab onto. Since you're going to be doing so much work on the head normally, you can bulk that area up a little easier, and it helps keep it really nice and secure on the armature. All right, this armature is almost finished. As I mentioned earlier, this character is obviously very different proportions than a normal human. Typically on a human armature, if it's a typical fit body type at least, you don't really have to do any sort of additional bulking up of the figure. You just, we'll get in that in another video, but you basically just add a layer of putty and skin the miniature and then just start sculpting as you want. But in this case, this guy's got a pretty large torso, nice belly. So in order to help give a little bit more structure to the figure for the clay to adhere to, I'm going to go ahead and add a layer of green stuff just to kind of bulk up the form a little bit ahead of time. I'm using the same mix of green stuff to Aves, about 50-50 blue-yellow, 50-50 of the AB part, and just getting it on there. I'd be remiss if I didn't also add that I am using a color shaper, a extra firm color shaper. That's what the black tip means, size 0. And I love using this, especially when I don't have any particular detail. But if I'm working with putty, the silicone tip is just perfect for pushing large amounts of putty around, and you don't have to worry about using any lubricant or anything like that because the putty is very sticky. You just push it around and get it into place, and no muss, no fuss. And with one last quick check against my scale reference, this armature is complete and ready for the next stage.
I hope you enjoyed the first part of this series. To make sure you know when the next one comes out, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. But for now, keep sculpting.